There are cars that defined a decade, cars that redefined performance, and then there's the 1990 Chevrolet Camaro, a machine that somehow managed to be all three while simultaneously being none of them. This was the car that American muscle built when it was trying to figure out who it wanted to be when it grew up. It had the body of a concept car, the heart of a Corvette's angry younger brother, and a parts bin that GM rated like they were shopping at a clearance sale. We're talking about a vehicle that could crack 150 miles per hour on the right stretch of tarmac, pull lateral Gs that embarrassed European sports sedans costing twice as much, and still leak like a submarine with screen doors if you ordered the wrong options. It was overbuilt in places that didn't matter and cost-cut in places that absolutely did. Celebrated by magazine testers and cursed by dealership service departments sometimes on the same afternoon. So strap in, because what you're about to hear is going to completely rewrite what you thought you knew about one of the most contradictory performance machines America ever built. But before we fire this thing up, drop a comment with the classic car you want us to deep dive next. Most liked comment becomes our next video. All right, let's get into it. The 1990 Chevrolet Camaro exists because of a boardroom vote that was closer than a photo finish at Daytona. Most enthusiasts assume the third-generation Camaro, running from 1982 through 1992, was printing money for General Motors. It wasn't. By the late 80s, GM's finance division was circling the Camaro program like sharks that smelled blood in the water. Sales were dropping. Insurance companies were classifying anything with a V8 and two doors as a financial liability for anyone under 30. The muscle car era looked dead and buried. Internal documents that surfaced years later revealed that in 1987, GM executives held a vote on whether to kill the Camaro nameplate entirely before 1990 even arrived. The decision came down to what insiders later described as uncomfortably close margins. The faction that saved it argued that abandoning Camaro would create a cultural vacuum that Chevrolet might never recover from. They were right. But every single 1990 Camaro rolling off the assembly line was a survivor of corporate politics that nearly ended the bloodline entirely. The body panels on your 1990 Chevrolet Camaro aren't what you think they are, and the reason why is equal parts innovation and desperation. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, GM had developed a well-earned reputation for building cars that rusted faster than you could say warranty claim. Owners in the Rust Belt watched their Camaros dissolve from the wheel wells upward like time-lapse footage of decomposition. The solution GM landed on for the third generation was radical. They built large sections of the body using sheet-modeled compound, essentially fiberglass-reinforced plastic. The roof, the front fascia, the rear quarter panels, all composite. This wasn't cheap. This was an engineering decision that actually made the car more impact-resistant and rust-proof than conventional steel. But here's where it gets weird. Because those panels didn't conduct electricity, early owners who tried sticking magnetic phone mounts or accessories to the body were completely baffled when nothing would stick. Dealerships fielded thousands of complaints from customers convinced their cars were defective. They weren't. They were just built from materials most people had never encountered on a production car. Body shops had to completely retrain their technicians because repairing a dented composite panel required entirely different tools and techniques. More than a few pristine body panels got destroyed in the early years by well-meaning repair shops treating them like steel and learning the hard way that they weren't. The wheel wells on the 1990 Camaro were absurdly oversized that factory engineers privately called them the caves. During the early design phase for the third generation back in the early 80s, the engineering team planned for optional wider performance tires that were going to be offered later in the production cycle. Those tires never materialized. What did materialize was a production car with wheel arches that looked like they were designed for rubber about 2 sizes wider than what actually came on the car. This wasn't just an aesthetic problem. At highway speeds, the excess space inside those wheel wells created unusual airflow patterns that generated a distinct low-frequency humming sound. Chevrolet's solution was to add foam baffling inside the wheel wells specifically to break up that airflow and kill the resonance. If you pull back the plastic wheel well liner on an original unrestored 1990 Chevrolet Camaro, you'll find those foam pieces still sitting there, hidden evidence of a fix for a problem that was never supposed to exist in the first place. The engine that powered the top-spec 1990 Chevrolet Camaro almost got branded with a name that would have started a civil war inside General Motors. The IROC-Z nameplate on the 1990 Camaro was borrowed from a racing series that had already moved on, and Chevrolet knew it. IROC stood for International Race of Champions, a competition featuring top drivers from different racing disciplines competing in identical cars. Chevrolet had sponsored the series using Camaros, and the IROC model name was born from that partnership. But by 1990, the International Race of Champions series had migrated to different cars entirely. Chevrolet was selling a performance model named after a sponsorship that no longer existed in the form that originally created the badge. When automotive journalists pointed this out, Chevrolet's official response was to acknowledge the question and then immediately redirect the conversation. It didn't matter to buyers. The IROC name had taken on a life completely separate from any racing connection. In 1990, it remained one of the most recognizable performance designations in America, even if the original reason for the name had driven off into the sunset years earlier. The 1990 Camaro Convertible solved its structural rigidity problem in a way that added over 150 pounds to the car and turned it into a noticeably slower machine. When you remove the roof from any car, you lose massive amounts of structural stiffness. Convertibles flex, they shake over rough pavement, the body develops creaks that drive owners insane and make engineers wake up in cold sweats. The third-generation Camaro Convertible addressed this with an extensive system of reinforcements welded into the floor, rocker panels, and firewall. Additional crossmembers went in during production. Bracing appeared under the seats. The engineering worked. The car didn't flex like a wet noodle. But those reinforcements were heavy, substantially heavier than originally projected. The convertible ended up weighing significantly more than the equivalent coupe, and the performance penalty was measurable with a stopwatch. 0 to 60 times for the convertible were noticeably slower than the coupe. Automotive magazines tested both versions back-to-back and published the numbers. Chevrolet's response was to emphasize the open-air driving experience rather than straight-line acceleration, which is exactly what you say when the stopwatch isn't delivering the results you want to talk about. The dashboard design in your 1990 Camaro was 8 years old by the time the car rolled off the assembly line, and Chevrolet chose not to update it for reasons that were both logical and slightly insulting to buyers. When the third-generation Camaro launched in 1982, the dashboard was considered modern and visually striking. By 1990, it was nearly a decade old and starting to look noticeably dated compared to competitors from Japan and Europe. Chevrolet's internal position was straightforward. Updating the dashboard would require significant retooling investment that couldn't be justified when an entirely new fourth-generation Camaro was already deep in development. So buyers purchasing a 1990 model were paying for an interior design that the company itself knew was approaching retirement. The unintended result is that today, the interior of a 1990 Camaro functions as a genuine time capsule, a perfect artifact of early 80s American interior design, frozen in place because nobody ever went back to change it. What was a cost-saving measure in 1990 has become a historical preservation project by accident. There was a factory option on the 1990 Camaro that made the car measurably faster without touching the engine, and most buyers never knew it existed. The option was the Performance Axle Ratio package, which changed the rear differential gearing to provide significantly quicker acceleration at the expense of slightly higher engine RPM at highway cruising speeds. This option was buried deep in the factory order sheets and never prominently advertised. Dealership sales staff often had no idea it existed. Buyers who stumbled across it while reading through the order book and asked questions frequently got blank stares in response. The Performance Axle Ratio completely transformed the driving character of the car. Launches from a stoplight were noticeably more aggressive. The engine felt more alive throughout the rev range. Cars equipped with this option are significantly more desirable among knowledgeable collectors today. Identifying whether a specific car has the Performance Axle Ratio requires checking the original build sheet codes, assuming that build sheet has survived 30-plus years of ownership transfers and restoration work. The windshield on the 1990 Camaro was raked at such an aggressive angle that it created a genuine optical phenomenon for taller drivers. The third-generation Camaro's dramatically sloped windshield was one of its most visually distinctive features, giving the car its low, predatory stance.
It also meant that drivers above approximately 6'2" would experience a prismatic distortion effect at certain sun angles. The thick tinted band at the top of the windshield would refract sunlight in a way that created a faint rainbow effect across the upper portion of their field of vision. This wasn't a manufacturing defect, it was simple physics interacting with glass geometry and solar angle. But dealerships received regular complaints about it, and service technicians unfamiliar with the phenomenon sometimes replaced windshields under warranty trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed because nothing was actually broken. The effect would simply reappear with the new glass under identical lighting conditions. A technical service bulletin was eventually issued explaining the situation, but it arrived late enough that more than a few perfectly good windshields had already been unnecessarily replaced.
The factory stereo system in the 1990 Camaro was installed in a location so acoustically problematic that the engineers responsible for it reportedly called the placement the compromised position. The standard audio setup placed the front speakers in the doors, which sounds reasonable until you factor in the hatchback body's unusual interior acoustics. The heavily sloped rear glass and the low roofline created reflective surfaces that bounced sound waves in patterns that made audio from the front speakers seem to originate from behind the driver rather than in front. Professional audio installers who worked on Camaros throughout the 90s developed specialized approaches to solving this problem. Custom-angled speaker pods, specific crossover tuning, strategically placed sound deadening material. The aftermarket car audio industry made serious money from Camaro owners who couldn't figure out why their factory stereo sounded directionally confused, no matter how much they adjusted the fader and equalizer settings. The answer was in the physics of the cabin geometry, and no amount of tone adjustment could fully correct it without physical modifications. During production of the 1990 Camaro, assembly line workers at the Van Nuys plant started a tradition that went completely undocumented for years and has only recently been discovered by restorers. At the end of each Friday's shift, the workers who had assembled that week's final completed Camaro would sign the inside of the door jamb, not on any visible surface, but on the inner flange behind the rubber weather stripping, where the signature would be completely hidden unless someone specifically removed the door seal to look for it. The tradition apparently started spontaneously when one worker signed a car as a personal mark of pride, and others began following suit. If you own a 1990 Camaro built at Van Nuys and you carefully peel back the door weather stripping, there's a possibility you'll find signatures. Some restoration specialists have documented finding them during complete teardowns. The names are ordinary, first names, sometimes a last initial, occasionally a date. But they're the marks of real people who built real cars, and they're still there, hidden and waiting to be discovered. The 1990 Camaro Z28 had a handling characteristic at the limit that engineers internally referred to as the snap, and taming it required one of the most carefully negotiated engineering compromises in the car's entire development process. The Z28 was the track-focused version of the Camaro, and when pushed to the absolute edge of its handling envelope, it exhibited a tendency towards sudden oversteer. This is common in rear-wheel drive performance cars. When the rear tires break traction, they tend to do so quickly. In the Z28, the transition from grip to slip was particularly abrupt, fast enough that casual drivers could find themselves sideways before having time to react. Chevrolet's engineers knew about this characteristic and debated it extensively. The purists on the development team argued that the snap was part of the car's character. It rewarded skilled drivers and punished inattentive ones, which was entirely appropriate for a performance machine. The more safety-conscious faction argued that it was a liability lawsuit waiting to happen. The final suspension calibration was a compromise that softened the rear setup slightly from what the purist engineers had originally preferred. The snap was reduced, but never fully eliminated, which is why experienced Camaro drivers will tell you to this day that the Z28 demands respect. You don't drive it casually, you drive it deliberately, or it will educate you very quickly about the consequences of inattention. The rear quarter panel design on the 1990 Camaro included a subtle aerodynamic feature that most owners never noticed, but that represented hundreds of hours of wind tunnel testing and development work. The trailing edge of the rear quarter panel featured a specific compound curve that was engineered to manage airflow over the back of the car at high speed. Without this curve, which measured only a few millimeters at its most pronounced point, the car experienced high-speed instability that manifested in testing as a slight wandering sensation in the rear end above 100 miles per hour. The aerodynamics team went through multiple iterations to find the solution, and the final shape was so subtle it looked purely decorative to casual observers. Chevrolet's marketing materials never mention this detail because explaining it would have required acknowledging that earlier design iterations had a stability problem. But the feature is there on every production car, a tiny hidden signature of engineering problem-solving that passed under the eyes of hundreds of thousands of owners without anyone knowing what they were actually looking at or why it mattered. The final 1990 Camaros built at the Van Nuys plant came off the assembly line on a specific Friday in late 1990, and the workers who built those cars spent that last shift doing something that was strictly against factory regulations. They were taking photographs. Production line photography was prohibited for numerous reasons related to proprietary manufacturing processes, trade secrets, and union rules. But as the end of the day shift approached and it became clear these were among the final Camaros of the model year, workers started pulling out cameras. Floor supervisors looked the other way. Line managers walked past without comment. The photographs captured by those workers that afternoon are now scattered through private collections, shared on enthusiast forums, and occasionally appear at automotive memorabilia auctions. They show the production line as it actually was, grimy, loud, brilliantly organized, and staffed by human beings who clearly cared deeply about what they were building. Some of those photographs show finished Camaros gleaming under harsh fluorescent factory lighting, with workers visible in the background, and the expressions on those faces tell you everything about what it meant to build something that genuinely mattered. The 1990 Camaro molded the absolute last IROC-Z that Chevrolet would ever officially manufacture, and almost nobody outside the company knew it was happening at the time. When the final IROC rolled off the production line, there was no ceremony, no announcement, no press release. The nameplate that had been synonymous with American performance muscle since 1985 simply stopped appearing in the order books when the 1991 model year arrived. The official reason given was trademark licensing. Chevrolet's agreement with the International Race of Champions organization had expired and wasn't renewed. But industry insiders suggested there was more to the story, including internal strategic discussions about brand image and where Camaro needed to position itself for the coming decade. Whatever the complete reasoning, the last IROC was sold, delivered, driven home, and gradually the name faded from options sheets without any fanfare whatsoever. Collectors who specifically seek out final-year IROC models today are chasing a piece of American performance history that ended quietly when it probably deserved a significantly louder send-off. Some things only become truly significant in retrospect. The last IROC-Z is absolutely one of them. A final chapter written in tire smoke and exhaust note on a California assembly line during an otherwise ordinary afternoon, and then it was simply gone. The 1990 Camaro was a machine standing at the intersection of everything. The end of a design generation, the final year of a legendary performance trim, the end of full production year at a historic assembly plant, and somehow still a car that could make your heart rate climb the moment you turn the key. That combination of history, engineering compromise, and raw American performance ambition is exactly why people are still obsessing over these cars decades later. Every single one of these facts, from the nearly canceled nameplate to those hidden door jam signatures to the completely mysterious option codes sitting dormant in factory documentation, tells the same fundamental story. Behind every significant car is a collection of human decisions, human compromises, human pride, and occasional human stubbornness that never makes it into the sales brochure. The 1990 Camaro wore all of those things inside its composite body panels and carried them down every road it ever traveled. And now you know things about it that most people who actually owned one never did. So here's my question for you. If you could go back to 1990 with current knowledge and order a brand new Camaro exactly how you wanted it, which options would you check and which ones would you absolutely avoid? Drop your build spec in the comments. And if this deep dive into Camaro history taught you something new, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started.